15 wealthiest billionaires in Canada have seen their net worth rise by over 30% since the pandemic began. And that can't just be pandemic profiteering, because many of these billionaires have assets in fields that have not done well during the pandemic. So what has caused these assets to inflate in value? Well, the answer is whenever the government, through its central bank, prints $400 billion of money and pumps it into the financial assets of the system, those who have assets become wealthier. And that would be just wonderful if there were no consequences for anyone else. But the historical experience is that when governments print money to pay their bills, which is effectively what they're doing here, that eventually it raises the cost of living for everyone else. Now, the bank claims they're technically not printing money. Well, the data that is available tells exactly the opposite story. In fact, the number of banknotes in circulation, these are the dollar, the bills, the 5s, the 10s, the 20s, that you could purchase things with, is up 8%, even at a time when people are using paper cash less than ever before. This is the largest percentage increase since the mid-1980s. M1 money supply is up 17%, even while the economy shrinks. And when the supply of money exceeds the production of goods and services, eventually, though not immediately, you experience inflation. A phenomenon that the Governor of the Bank of Canada admitted to me before the Finance Committee falls heaviest on the shoulders of the poorest people. Why? Because they deal disproportionately in cash, whereas the wealthy can protect themselves from inflation by shoveling their money into assets that inflate in value. The poor deal mostly in cash and therefore have their very limited net worth eaten away. And so here we have a monstrous policy of transferring wealth from wage earners to asset holders, from the working class to the wealthy. Now, the Prime Minister should know this, because when he was asked his definition of rich versus middle class, he said, well, the middle class are the people who live off wages. The rich are those who live off assets. And here right now we have a policy that is specifically designed to transfer wealth from those who earn wages to those who earn capital gains through their assets. There is no doubt that this phenomenon will lead to a greater concentration of wealth, that the wealthiest 1% who own the most expensive and luxurious real estate and have in their portfolios the most stocks and bonds and other financial instruments are going to continue to see their net worth expand, having done nothing, by the way, to deserve that expanded net worth. It is not because they invented a new product or delivered a new service. It's simply because they sat back in their rocking chairs while the Governor of the Bank of Canada and the banking system that it creates pumped air into those very same assets. Try to talk to a young person who's attempting to buy a house these days. The asset inflation of real property has put that out of reach. Whereas the wealthy who are already landed and in possession of luxurious real estate properties become wealthier and wealthier still. And yet, here we are debating the disclosures of one member's personal assets. I can't get the Bank of Canada to give me information about the amount it paid and what it got for its purchases of these assets. One of the very interesting things about how this all works is that the Bank of Canada is the financial agent of the government. So when this government runs these huge deficits, it raises the money by selling bonds into the marketplace to investors. But with this new program of printing money and purchasing assets, the bank is now buying back the very same bonds that it sells out. So it sells a bond to a wealthy investor to raise money for the Prime Minister to spend. And then, sometimes in the same week or month, purchases the same bond right back from the same investor. Now, I've asked the Bank of Canada if there have been cases where the bank sells a bond and then buys it back at a higher price, thereby profiting the investor at the expense of the taxpayer-owned bank. In other words, the investor gets rich by arbitraging the difference between the price at which he purchased the bond from our central bank and the price for which the bank bought it right back. Now, the bank won't tell me if this is happening, but when we're talking about $400 billion worth of transactions, that is bigger than the normal program spending of the Government of Canada for a year. It is twice as much as the governments of Canada spend on health care. To put it into perspective, it is an absolutely enormous sum of money. And yet, the bank won't release information on who's profiting at whose expense. So I asked the finance minister, and she said, well, ask the Bank of Canada. Well, I did ask the Bank of Canada. They won't give me the numbers. And so we have in the House of Commons here MPs who are squabbling, NDP is squabbling over a $6 billion wealth tax. Okay, the Liberals are bragging that they brought in a new tax on stock options that's going to raise $50 million. Okay, we're talking about $400 billion here that the central bank is playing with. Many, many orders of magnitude larger in sum and consequence than the chicken scratch that Liberals and New Democrats are fighting over. They always tell us they're so worried that the rich are getting richer. But when our central bank that is supposed to be accountable to us, whose $5 million in shares are held in the name of the finance minister, pumps $400 billion into financial markets and enriches the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the working class wage earner, you hear nothing but silence from the social justice warriors on the other side of the House of Commons, because they're just fine seeing the wealth gap get bigger as long as government gets bigger along with it. We on this side of the House believe in financial transparency, in merit-driven wealth rather than crony capitalism. And we call on this House to demand greater accountability and transparency from our central bank and from our government, because this money is Canadians' money, and we are their voice.